Good evening, and welcome to the Frick Collection's Wednesday night lecture series. My name is Emerson Bowyer, and I am guest curator of the exhibition currently on display in the lower galleries, David d'Angers, Making the Modern Monument. Tonight's lecture will be broadcast live on the Frick's website and that of our partner, Fora TV. Following the lecture, the lower galleries will remain open for half an hour so that we might continue our discussion amongst the works themselves. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Dorothy Johnson, Roy J. Carver Professor of Art History at the University of Iowa. Professor Johnson received her PhD from Berkeley, and since then she has published widely on French art of the 18th and 19th centuries. Her books include Jacques-Louis David, Art in Metamorphosis, Jacques-Louis David, The Farewell of Telemachus and Eucharis, and most recently, David to Delacroix, The Rise of Romantic Mythology. She is also the editor of Jacques-Louis David, New Perspectives. Her numerous essays have appeared in such publications as the Art Bulletin, Art History, Gazette des Beaux-Arts, 18th Century Studies, Master Drawings, the Cambridge Companion to Delacroix, and Studies in Voltaire and the 18th Century. Amongst these, I will single out her wonderful essays on the work of David d'Angers, particularly his drawings. These essays, as well as Professor Johnson's influential work on Jacques-Louis David, are models of scholarly inquiry that were never far from my desk during the production of the Frick's current exhibition and its catalogue. She is also the translator of perhaps the most important published work on David d'Angers, Jacques de Casso's David d'Angers, Sculptural Communication in the Age of Romanticism. I am thrilled that Professor Johnson has joined us to present this lecture entitled Vital Signs, The Art of David d'Angers. Please welcome Professor Dorothy Johnson.
Thank you, Emerson, for that very kind introduction. I'd like to thank the Frick Collection for this kind invitation, Ian Wardropper, Colin Bailey, and especially Emerson Boyer, the curator of this wonderful exhibition, who asked me if I would speak on David d'Angers this evening. I welcome the opportunity to speak on one of my favorite artists and one who I've been studying with increasing affection and appreciation since the beginning of my career. We're looking at the great Romantic sculptor, David d'Angers, posing with his 1839 Statue of Liberty, who is depicted as a young woman wearing a tunic and a Phrygian cap. This is one of the few overtly allegorical figures that he sculpted and embodies a subject dear to his heart. David's career spanned the first half of the 19th century, a period that witnessed several revolutions, uprisings, and tumultuous changes in regimes. Like his mentor and teacher, whom he revered, the great neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David, David d'Angers believed in the goals of the 1789 French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. These words were not mere shibboleths to this fiercely Republican sculptor. In his copious and eloquent writings, articles, notebooks, correspondence, he reveals in words what he embodies in his art, namely that he was impassioned by humanitarian, political, and social beliefs, and inspired and moved by the human misery and suffering that he saw everywhere. David was a meliorist. Because of his deeply idealistic nature, he believed that human behavior at its best could improve society, and in particular make life better for the poor and disenfranchised. And art, like all of the great human endeavors, can contribute to making life better through the ideas it communicated. Art could change people's minds. Following the great philosophe and art critic Diderot, who reiterated Horace's famous dictum, David d'Angers believed art should delight as well as instruct. He wanted his Statue of Liberty, that we see here, to be widely disseminated so it could inspire even the most humble families with its message. To this end, he sought to have it replicated on a small scale and made affordable so that people with little money could own it and meditate on its meaning. He wrote in 1830 to Louis de Potter, "Regarding the small Statue of Liberty, I made it so it could be purchased by the people. Thus, it would be a good idea to give it to a plaster caster. Let us hope that one day we will see the image of liberty in humble homes. She is a saint who well deserves the most fervent cult." If liberty merited her own cult, so did the great individuals of history who contributed to liberty in all forms: intellectual, scientific, political, and artistic. And here is his 1834 bronze statue of Jefferson, commissioned by Uriah Phillips Levy and given as a gift to Congress. It's located in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. In his left hand, Jefferson holds a quill, and in his right, an unfurled Declaration of Independence inscribed with the words he penned. And actually, it's the right hand with the quill and left with the monumental Declaration of Independence. Another example of the sculptor's great veneration for the individuals who improve conditions for humankind can be seen in his monument to Gutenberg, completed in 1840 for the city of Strasbourg, that in rivalry with Mainz claimed the inventor of the printing press as its own. We're looking at the full-size plaster cast in the Musée David in Angers. Little is known of the commission except that David executed the drawings in plaster at his own expense, and that he fervently wanted to execute the statue. He represents Gutenberg in a richly textured late medieval costume, holding a large sheet he has pulled off the press behind him with a quote from Genesis, "Et la lumière fut," and there was light, in monumental letters. The famous Gutenberg Bible was printed in Latin in the 1450s, and a printed version in French was not made until almost a century later. David's choice thus indicates the resonances of Gutenberg's invention through the ages, because the printing press, as we know, led to the mass production of books, which brought and still brings intellectual enlightenment to the public. At the base of the monument in Strasbourg are 4 reliefs that demonstrate the profound political and social changes for the better across the world, brought about by printed documents and books, including the founding of democracy in the United States and the writers who advocated for the abolition of slavery. For David, the reliefs were a very important facet of the monument, for they presented historical episodes in which the great individual played a pivotal role. David d'Angers dedicated most of his career to instantiating in sculpted form the great individuals of modern culture, those who contributed to the support and continuance of civilization through advancement of knowledge, as well as understanding of the arts, especially scientists, thinkers, writers, artists, but also military heroes who defended the French nation and assured her future. His sculpted simulacra of these illustrious individuals of modern civilization transcended the boundaries of portraiture with its goals of recording for posterity facial features and expression. His goal was to make sculpture come alive so that the figures he represented could enter into dialogue with present and future generations. We're looking here at a funerary monument to the great Enlightenment writer, educator, and poet, the Archbishop Fenelon, who reveals through his gesture that his writings and teaching were heartfelt. This image, like that of Gutenberg, is a portrait, but David wanted his statues, busts, and medallions not just to replicate the physiognomies of the important individuals of his epoch, although this was one important element, but to embody and call to mind in the imagination of present and future viewers the significant contributions these individuals had made. He wrote that he wanted to make the features of the man of genius live for 4,000 years after his death. This quote reveals his acknowledgement of the perdurability of sculpture and also his belief that the human achievement of the great individuals lasts for millennia. This idea will resonate throughout the lecture, namely the need to honor and commemorate in order to encourage, because David knew, to borrow Spinoza's epigram, that excellent things are as difficult as they are rare. David d'Angers worked in a variety of formats to commemorate the great individuals of his epoch: the commissioned statue, the sculpted relief, portrait busts, and medallions. In my lecture this evening, I would like to explore examples from the different registers of his art, as case studies in order to give an idea of the complexity, range, and diversity of his multifarious oeuvre, which is made clear in the Frick's wonderful exhibition. At the same time, we will discover a unifying thread that links the great breadth of his great commemorative works, namely his interest in a visual language of signs that could be interpreted and read by current and future generations. We're looking here at one of David's most poetic and lyrical commissioned works, his 1847 funerary monument to General Gaubert in the cemetery of Père-Lachaise in Paris. General Gaubert, who had served in the army during the French Revolution and was known for his skill and heroism in battle, was killed in 1808 in Spain while leading his troops in battle during the Peninsular War. The complex monumental equestrian group depicts Gaubert at the moment after he is struck on the head by a bullet and fatally wounded. And here is the print from the 1847 edition of Illustration. David shows Gaubert losing consciousness as he falls from his horse. This group was greatly admired by the late 19th century sculptor Rodin, who called it absolutely beautiful. The transition between life and death was of great interest in the late 18th and early 19th centuries and had been written about by the famous physiologist and Dr. Bichat in his 1801 treatise, Studies on Life and Death. In a long passage, Bichat describes in detail the stages of impairment that ensue with great rapidity after a fatal blow to the head, beginning with the cessation of cerebral activity that severs vital connections to nerves, muscles, tissues, and organs that constitute life. After the head is struck, the body collapses. David greatly admired Bichat. We will return later to his monuments to Bichat, and would have first encountered his text and ideas as a young student at the Classe des Arts, where the curriculum required the study of anatomy via dissection and an understanding of physiology. We see in the Gaubert monument an essential element that informs the variety of David's artistic creation, namely a belief in art as a system of signs that needs to be decoded to be understood. These signs are part of a cultural, intellectual, and historical fabric. A great artist can condense, distill, and clarify the signs to make the meaning accessible to contemporaneous as well as future observers. Throughout his writings, David, in accord with so many Romantic thinkers and writers, articulates his belief that the world itself is a forest of signs and symbols, whose vast and comprehensive, yet often mysterious, albeit not perforce esoteric, visual language compels us to constantly read and interpret it. This calls to mind a famous passage from Baudelaire's poem, Correspondences, which became a foundation of symbolism in which the poet describes man and nature as passing through a forest of symbols. David d'Angers believed that this language of visual signs and codes was universal. These utopian beliefs informed his monuments to the great individuals. As we shall see in his sculpted figures, David used every facet of this language of signs to communicate meaning: facial expression, corporal configuration, costume, and most dramatic of all, the apposite gesture. In an article on the nature of sculpture cited in the current exhibition catalog, he wrote, "Gesture is the language of sculpture. The pose, the look of necessity precedes speech, as lightning precedes thunder. In art, gesture is the most powerful means of expression, in that it reveals a soul so profoundly moved that, impatient to manifest itself, it chooses the most rapid signs." This precept, which constitutes the essence of his sculpted oeuvre, is evinced in his earliest student works, in which he first explores the apposite gesture as an immediate and indelible sign of what is in the heart and soul, indeed the mind of the figure represented. Like so many scientists, thinkers, philosophers, and writers of the period which witnessed the birth of the disciplines of psychiatry and psychology, David was profoundly interested in psychological subtleties of human thought, emotion, and personality. In order to express and make explicit in the sculpted figure these psychological states and responses, he used anatomical exaggeration and distortion of limbs, torsos, and heads. These elements of the body could serve as signs that revealed intense inner states of being that could be readily decoded by viewers. We see all of these elements in play in his brilliant student relief of 1811, The Death of Epaminondas, which won the Prix de Rome and enabled the young sculptor to spend several years of fellowship study in the Eternal City. He represents the tragic and untimely death of the great Theban general and virtuous hero Epaminondas, who was fatally wounded in battle by a poisoned spear and borne from the battlefield by his devoted soldiers who respond in various ways to his impending death. David represents the moment when the hero reflects on his love of country. Epaminondas had stated that he could die happily once he received the news that his army had won the battle and defeated the Spartan enemy. The emotional state of the dying hero upheld by warriors so that he can better view his shield, and the range of emotions expressed by his soldiers from reserved and resigned to overwrought are conveyed through great expressiveness of body, pose, and gesture. Another student work, La Douleur, or Suffering, astutely analyzed by Emerson Boyer in the catalog of the exhibition, takes up a similar theme of anguish and pain, this time in the academic assignment of the expressive head. The work manifests the artist's uncanny ability to replicate nature in three-dimensional form, a brilliant example of mimesis, and at the same time conveys intense suffering through the facial features contorted in pain, but also through the strained tendons of the neck. David d'Angers, like other aspirant artists of the period, was a devoted student of anatomy, which he studied not only through anatomical plates, the écorché or flayed figure, and wax and plaster models, but also through dissection. He believed that sculptors, like painters, should have complete mastery of anatomy. During his student days in Paris, he even collaborated with a friend who was a medical student on an anatomy book for art students. Here's an example of one of his illustrations, which reveals the extent of his study and mastery. David wrote that artists needed to study anatomy and physiology profoundly in order to render nature magnified in its striking reality. The study of anatomy was part of his project announced at the beginning of his career to make the sculpted figure appear alive. He wanted to animate marble and bronze, to pursue movement and life. He wrote, "My greatest ambition as an artist is to make these words disappear, la froide sculpture, cold sculpture." He achieves this in a marble statue made in Rome during his fellowship years, the young shepherd boy of 1815. Here, the lowered head and right hand placed against the cheek are signs of meditation and thought in a figure that so closely resembles nature, albeit in its ideal form, that it appears almost alive and moving. David reveals in this beautiful and sensitive figure the extent to which he could combine the classical ideal with the live model. He would pursue this classical aesthetic rarely, however, choosing instead contemporaneous costume as seen in the statues of Jefferson, Gutenberg, Fenelon, and Gobert. But one brilliant exception can be seen in his funerary monument to General Bonchamp, completed in 1824 for the Church of Saint-Florent. We're looking at the plastic replica in Angers. David depicts the young general at the moment just preceding his death, performing his last act on earth. The beautiful athletic hero, a semi-nude, semi-recumbent figure, dazzlingly naturalistic but with a classicizing idealism, was inspired by a figure on the Parthenon frieze. During the Revolution, the royalist General Bonchamp was fatally wounded in a battle with the Republican Army in 1793 in David's native region of the Vendée. His last act was to give clemency to 5,000 Republican prisoners, and David depicts him speaking the words inscribed beneath him on the tomb, "Mercy to the prisoners." And this is a detail from the marble. The eloquent gesture functions as a brilliant rhetorical sign. The outstretched, powerful right hand in particular serves as an unconditional sign of the command for clemency. David sought out this commission not for political reasons. As an avowed Republican, he was opposed to royalist rule, but for very personal reasons. His father had been one of the prisoners saved by Bonchamp. Throughout his career, we typically find this type of interpenetration of the public and private. David refused to accept commissions for famous individuals whom he believed had not made positive humanitarian contributions and who were therefore unworthy of commemoration for posterity. David was a didactic artist for whom the separation of art and morality was not possible. In a majority of works, David favored costume over heroic nudity, a central debate for artists of the time. Nudity renders the figure timeless, outside of historical specificity, while costume locates the figure in a specific time and place. History and the significant moment were pivotal to David's concept of the great individual who contributes to civilization through a prepotent action, invention, or idea. In his first public commission, the Grand Condé, for example, made for the Restoration government and completed in 1817 for the Pont de la Concorde in Paris, we see him making the over life-size statue animate by means of intensity of gesture and pantomime, but also through a canny use of costume, which serves as a sign of the historical moment and also adds to the drama and sense of movement. We're looking here at the plaster replica in the David Museum in his hometown of Angers. The original was destroyed. The Grand Condé was a great 17th century military commander and hero depicted at a significant moment in the Battle of Fribourg when he is about to throw his baton into the enemy camp to inspire his army to attack with renewed vigor. David's statue is a masterpiece of dramatic torsion, for the Condé is like a coiled spring about to be released. The most remarkable feature of the figure is vitality and energy, made even more explicit in these preparatory drawings which reveal a kinetic energy, one that can be seen in the statue, especially from specific angles. The costume is part of the language of vital signs that communicate the contributions of the man of action, the military hero who saves his country by defeating its enemies and therefore ensures the future survival of French civilization. But the body of the military hero could also convey significant actions and deeds without the aid of costume, as in General Bonchamp. The Grand Condé and Bonchamp, through differing modalities, embody David's ideas on the statue to the great individual as an apotheosis. In a letter to his friend Victor Pavie, he wrote, "The sculptor, from the instant he takes up his chisel to represent the great man, feels that he is going to make an apotheosis, that he will outline a poem with a single figure. It is not only a physical man, it is the immaterial being that must envelope the material being and serve as an aureole in order to make the spectators understand that this apparition is that of a man destined by nature to leave a durable monument useful to humanity. It is not only the great man that one seeks to make shine in the brilliance of his glory, it is also the realization of a great historical deed, or the most elevated point to which science has been brought by the person whose features are being consecrated. The man of genius draws to himself all the great minds disseminated throughout the globe. They are his arms, he is the head, the center, the unity, the resume, and becomes the myth of an epoch. That is what the statue is." And so David thought deeply about his choices for commemoration. He only accepted or sought public commissions for those heroes of history and culture worthy of the monument. Many works David created were not commissioned, but were privately made on his own time and at his own expense, because he believed in the necessity of leaving these vital signs to posterity. Some of David's most eloquent and remarkable statues are dedicated to the writers, thinkers, and scientists of the modern age. One that he sculpted out of veneration was his magnificent colossal head of Goethe that he made in 1829 when he was visiting the brilliant poet, novelist, naturalist, and thinker in Weimar. Goethe was nearing the end of his life and was enjoying the height of his fame. He welcomed the sculptor into his home as a friend. The head is one of David d'Angers' most extraordinary homages to the great men. It is also one of a series of encomiastic monuments that he sculpted to honor the modern geniuses of the natural sciences, whom he believed, as did many of his contemporaries, had contributed directly to opening up and reading the great book of nature, to making her signs and symbols legible for the first time in human history. David d'Angers wrote the following: "The individuality of beings and objects, these are the scattered notes of the great book of nature. Only the man of genius can understand them and communicate the meaning of their great unity." We will see that in many of his commemorative statues to scientific geniuses, the head is enlarged vis-a-vis the body to indicate the importance of the predominance of thought. In Goethe, the colossal head replaces the body, and in this case, functions as a sign of the vastness of thought and the many domains that were enlightened and opened up by this great thinker. Rather than consider this a large-scale portrait bust, I believe we should consider this work a completed monument constituted by the head alone, which takes precedence over the body in this case and in fact completely displaces it. David d'Angers reveals in his writings the extent to which he was immersed in the natural sciences and the contributions of their great men, including the polymath Goethe, whom he admired for his studies of plant morphology, mineralogy, and ideas of transformism. In his colossal head, he seeks to emphasize Goethe's capacious mind through the massive structure of the skull, which houses the great brain within, but he combines details of structure and portrait-like features of the elderly genius with the wrinkles, sags, and pits in the skin that are combined with an expression of kindly wisdom. David d'Angers' life-size statue of Georges Cuvier, commissioned by the Gallery of Mineralogy in the Natural History Museum in the Jardin des Plantes and begun in 1838, constitutes another fascinating homage to a famous naturalist who played a major role in founding the disciplines of comparative anatomy and paleontology. His Animal Kingdom of 1817 had an enormous and enduring impact. Cuvier, who is professor of natural history at the Collège de France and the Jardin des Plantes, is depicted with a massive head, seat of his intellect, a head that emerges from heavy academic robes which bespeak his scholarly and institutional position, contributions, and honors. The material itself is magnificently rendered in marble. Cuvier looks directly at his right hand and seems to be observing the movement of his fingers. He was famous for his study of the structures of bones in living animals as well as fossils. His left hand rests on a facsimile of the Earth, which is not a cartographic globe with identifications written on the continents and oceans. We do see clearly discerned, however, the external surface of the land masses and the oceans. Cuvier has plunged his index finger into a massive crevice in the continent of Africa. This emblematic gesture refers to his recognition of Africa as the place of the origins of life on Earth. His study of the fossil remains and the stratifications of the Earth to uncover her history, and to his theory of the cataclysmic upheavals in the surface of the Earth that he believed had led to the extinction of species. In 1825, he published discourses on the revolutions of the surface of the globe. David made several monuments in different formats to honor another great man of science, the renowned anatomist, physiologist, and physician Bichat, who made remarkable contributions to these disciplines before dying at the age of 30. As mentioned earlier, he is best remembered for his influential studies on life and death of 1801. The most well-known of the sculptor's homages is the bronze statue in the courtyard of the École de Médecine in Paris from 1855, where we see Bichat, the scientist, thinker, and writer with pen in hand, meditating. David emphasizes his large head in proportion to his body, an expressive exaggeration to emphasize the importance of his intellect to history. The gruesome cadaver at his feet is the object of Bichat's meditations, for it was in studying the sick and dissecting the dead that he sought to uncover the secrets of life and death. David wrote that the cadaver serves as a hieroglyph or emblem, a sign of the mystery of human life and what remains when life has left. The cadaver had already appeared in David d'Angers' earlier civic monument to Bichat in Bourg-en-Bresse from 1843, serving in this case as a reference to the importance of the dead and helping to save the lives of the living by revealing their secrets. The cadaver itself is a less gruesome creature than the one in the later work. It is still recognizable as a once-suffering human being. And it's a little bit hard to see, but it's right there. We see in the plastic replica the seated Bichat ausculting a thin, sick child. The sculptor wrote the following about his monument in a letter to his friend Victor Pavie, explaining his use of visual signs. In the group of Bichat, I sought to erect a monument to the science of physiology. 3 existences are presented on this monument. One is dreamlike, vegetative, pure as the dawn of a cloudless day, the child. The other occupies the middle, the summit of the human period, Bichat. This figure is passionate, devoured by emotions. It thinks and consumes. It tries to raise a corner of the veil that hides the mysterious secrets of creation. Finally, at the base of this pyramid is the dead figure, another obscure hieroglyphic existence. Here is a trilogy. I have used it to display my physiological drama. In these monuments to Bichat and the colossal head of Goethe and the powerful gesture of Cuvier, David was busy interpreting the hieroglyphic signs of nature, thought, and creation. In his head of Goethe, we noted David concentrated not just on the structure of the head, but on very natural details of physiognomy. And he made the head, although huge in scale, appear like an intimate portrait of the elderly philosopher, one that gives us a personal glimpse into his meditative character and mind. David was a brilliant portrait sculptor, and his uncanny ability to represent portrait likenesses was a key element in the success of his commemorative statues. A record of facial features was of prepotent importance to the art of portraiture and was one of the first things David mastered, as we have seen. It is not surprising, then, that he created a very considerable number of portrait busts, commemorating and paying homage to the great men and women of his time, whether commissioned or not. David also liked to work directly from the live model, an aspect of his artistic practice that contributes greatly to the sense of vivacity and immediacy in the portraits, part of his avowed project to animate sculpture, to make its signs vital. He certainly animates and brings to life in an almost kinetic manner the features and personality of the great musical genius Paganini, who was revered in Paris, where he came to perform. The great romantic painter Delacroix conveys the liveliness and intensity of Paganini in his 1831 portrait of the musician. David d'Angers achieves an equal liveliness and an even greater intensity in his sculpted portrait bust from the early 1830s. We see a remarkable animation and mobility in the features and hair combined with an intensity of psychological concentration. It is as if David wanted to create in sculpture, here in the medium of bronze, the antithesis of that massive, unwieldy, and heavy material. Bronze can reflect light in remarkable ways, and David has used this reflective facet of the material to convey movement, rhythm, life, and vitality. In his magnificent portrait busts of women, David uses different styles, media, and formats to convey subtle aspects and qualities of individual personality. In his portrait bust of the American, Anne Buchan Robinson, he employs a neoclassical style to depict this young, beautiful, and serious woman. The marble head is idealized, severe, geometric, yet at the same time very soft and subtly modulated in the depiction of the skin. The high forehead bespeaks intelligence, the odd and striking coiffure calls attention to the shape of the skull, and the coils of the hair remind us of the coils of the brain, center of thought, to which they may refer as vital signs. The rendering of hair was extremely important in Romantic art. It could serve as an indicator and even an instantiation of human thought and emotion. David uses a very different style to represent his friend, the British writer and abolitionist, Amelia Opie. In this intimate, vivid, and psychologically revelatory portrait made in a naturalistic style, David emphasizes her physiognomy to underscore her individuality. Her Quaker bonnet, sculpted in exquisite detail, serves as an extension and elaboration of her head. The complex and divergent forms function as signs of her rich and capacious mind. In 1829-30, David adverts to the days he spent with her in the cemetery of Père Lachaise and noted, "I've spent entire days there listening to this interesting, modest, and tender woman. I enjoyed her conversation, her genius of observation." We can see that he sought to convey these qualities in the beautiful commemorative portrait bust. He also made a remarkable drawing of her from life that captures her serenity, self-possession, modesty, and also depicts an unusual gesture of her left hand. And here's another beautiful and sensitive drawing of the head of a woman, which is in the current exhibition. Finished in exquisite detail, it may be a preparatory drawing for a medallion. David created over 500 portable medallions to honor the great men and women of his epoch, including writers and artists. Here's his medallion of Goethe. He typically gave the medallions as gifts to the sitters who were being honored, but they could also be reproduced in multiples for wide dissemination and circulation. The medallions constitute a type of private portable pantheon of the cultural greats of modern civilization that belong to the realm of personal homage as well as public commemoration. They mostly depict portrait heads in profile and low relief with an emphasis on recognizable and distinguishable facial features accompanied by the individual's name or even signature. For David, the profile captured the essential tracing or outline of the individual. Thus, the profile is a silhouette that records the individual's unique physiognomy. The name or signature is an accompanying sign. The verbal and visual word and image function together to commemorate the great individual. One can adduce here David's medallion of the great naturalist and realist painter, Rosa Bonheur. He honored the great romantic painter Delacroix in a medallion, as well as the latter's friend and rival, Ingres. The romantic painter Delacroix, who died young, is an exception. We see a frontal view of his face in this posthumous medallion. David would often travel to visit the greats whom he wished to commemorate. He went to Germany to see Goethe, and he also traveled there to see the great romantic landscape painter Friedrich. We see here in the portrait medallion from 1834. David had a love for and fascination with German culture, which was unusual for a French artist of his time. Friedrich gave David several beautiful landscape drawings, including the owl on the grave with its haunting romantic elements of the cemetery at night, moonlight, and the owl, harbinger of death, above the open grave. All of these elements functioned as signs for David of a universal visual language whose syntax, symbols, and metaphors communicated profound ideas. David loved the medium of drawing. In addition to his preparatory sketches for medallions, busts, and monuments, he also made a number of beautiful visionary drawings that belong to an independent category of art, a means of exploring artistic ideas that would never be painted or sculpted. I had the good fortune to study this extensive corpus of drawings preserved in the David Museum in Angers. It was there that I first saw one of his most remarkable images, made while he was a fellowship student in Rome in 1815, Sappho at Leucadia. He represents the great poetess at a moment of abject despair after her lover Phaon has rejected her. According to the mythic narrative, Sappho goes to the Leucadian cliff to leap to her death over unrequited love. David d'Angers in his drawing shows Sappho literally being killed by love. A child Eros pushes her off the cliff. This is not suicide, but murder. We can see in this drawing David's use of gestural and corporal signs in the figure of Sappho, whose contorted and unbalanced position on the edge of the precipice is counterbalanced by her billowing hair and cape. Her head is thrust back in despair in an anatomically impossible right angle, and her elongated arms and claw-like hands beseech the heavens. This is high drama and pathos, the story and her psychological state conveyed through eloquent corporal signs. In another extraordinary large-scale religious drawing, Christ Riding on the World, David echoes the famous episode from the Gospel of St. John in which Christ writes in the dust, the only instance of his writing. We do not know what he wrote. David, in his visionary drawing, makes the writing explicit. He depicts a Republican Christ inscribing on the world in his own blood liberty, equality, fraternity. David described in his notebook of the mid-1830s his vision for the subject: to represent Christ seated on the world and writing with his finger dipped in his own blood, liberty, equality. He will be very thin, but with a noble thinness that comes from a soul that consumes the body. He will be melancholy because that is the expression of all men who love humanity and who concern themselves with the amelioration of the human condition. He will still be crowned with thorns, and blood will flow from his wounds. This blood will cover the whole world. The drawing which he gave to his friend, the renowned Christian socialist Lamennais, corresponds closely to this description. It activates the textual source from the Gospels, and at the same time reveals the extent to which the language of signs, elements of the visible world, could be used to communicate in art a complex nexus of ideas. I would like to conclude my lecture today with a case study of a complex commemorative monument to his son, Robert, entitled The Child with Grapes. We can trace the evolution of this portrait, which David transformed into a symbolic monument through a variety of formats: a medallion, drawings, a christening cup decorated with reliefs, and finally the statue. They were all made to honor for posterity his young son, Robert David. But let us look briefly first at his touching medallion of his daughter, Hélène David. He shows her smelling a flower, one that looks like a daisy, which symbolizes innocence. Why commemorate a young child's features for posterity? After all, this cannot be a portrait with fixed and stabilized features, because the child's features will dramatically change as she grows older. I believe David wanted to commemorate Hélène at a moment of absolute innocence, although the necklace and decorated cap presage the future hope for her beauty as she grows into a woman. David, like many of his fellow romantics influenced by the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, had a veneration for the state of childhood, but he was also profoundly moved by the innocence, vulnerability, and plight of children in the world. His notebooks are filled with his sadness for the misery of poor children, for example, as well as those who suffer from illness, handicaps, and neglect. We've seen an example of this in his statue of Bichat trying to diagnose a sick child. The threat of infant and childhood mortality, so prevalent during this period, added a persistent strain of anxiety and fear of sudden loss to the anticipated delights parents took in raising their children. David put a great deal of pathos and emotion into his statue honoring the revolutionary child martyr Barra, who had died for upholding the principles of the revolution. His sculpture from 1839 is a form of homage to his mentor and teacher, Jacques-Louis David, whose Barra, struggling in the last moments of life, alludes directly to the maternal misery that will ensue, for the child holds in his hand a letter probably either from or to his mother. David d'Angers represents Barra immediately after death and emphasizes the frailty of the child. The skin and muscles of his thin body have already begun to sag, rendering the image even sadder and more heartbreaking. But his commemorative statue to his son is in a different realm from these examples, a register in which portraiture and symbolism become confluent. For in his drawings and sculptures dedicated to his son Robert, he transforms a private and highly personal vision into a commemoration of childhood itself. In his various modes of commemorating his son as a young child, David sought to make an individualized portrait universalized in its meaning. The sweet and chubby little boy contentedly sucking his thumb in the medallion captures a characteristic gesture that stands for all children of that age. While a highly personal work for him as the child's father, it also consecrates a universal stage in childhood development. The reliefs that adorn the christening cup he made for his son in 1834 take the idea even further, for they represent stages of childhood in which the little boy is being educated and nurtured by an allegorical figure of nature, as well as an allegorical figure of the country. The country and nature replace the parents. The cup serves as a prognostication of hope for the child's future. David wants his son, and by extension all children in this visual language of signs, to be brought up by nature herself as well as the country. The images of the innocent young child are framed by a beautiful and lyrical array of symbolic plants and flowers, and this reminds us of David's comment, "In nature, everything is sign and appearance." Each element of nature unveils a symbolic meaning for him. On the left, the country suckles Robert at her breast so that he drinks in the wholesome milk of her maternal goodness. On the right, nature holds up a bunch of grapes that the child eagerly reaches up for. The child reaching up for or holding grapes had long established precedents in classical art, well known to David and his contemporaries, particularly examples of the child Dionysus. The cup, of course, precedes the statue of his 2-year-old son, begun in 1836. And the image of nature with grapes attracting the small child seen on the christening cup would seem to be the direct source of inspiration for it. But then David relates in a letter from 1836 that he observed his son in the garden reaching for grapes, and he actually made several drawings of this on the spot. This would seem to be a remarkable case of real life enacting an allegory he had already conceived of and sculpted. He describes his observation in the garden in the following terms. Finally, I am preparing a statue of my Robert, who is suspended from a grapevine in order to eat grapes. I surprised him in this movement in the middle of my garden, and grateful for this opportunity to fix the features of my dear child when he was still at a most tender age. David describes his child as hanging, suspended from the grapevine as though an element of vegetal life, an example of the permeability in David's mind between the natural and the mystical. He claims in the letter that he was inspired to make the statue of his son by this moment in the garden, and the vivid sketches from life seem to support his account. In the drawings on the life-size statue, which records the individualized features of his son's face, the allegorical figure of Mother Nature, who had held up the grapes enticingly for the eager child on the christening cup, is replaced by the vine itself. David attaches his son to the vine as if he is a flower growing from it himself. This notion, of course, belongs to one of the most important romantic ideas, that of nature as progenitor and nurturer of the child. David has emphasized the portrait elements, the facial features, the thick wavy hair, the delicacy and gracefulness of the forms. He represents the child nude. This removes him from the specific time and place delineated by costume to the timeless, universal, mythic realm associated with the classical tradition. Nudity in classical art and its revivals could have a variety of meanings, but an essential meaning, and one that I think apposite in this case, is that nudity symbolizes truth. The slender and graceful proportions of the child echo that of the vine that seems to bend over him protectively. David makes the visual analogy between the tree and human life, an ancient trope in Western thought that had great importance during the Romantic period. Robert reaches up eagerly for the sweet and ripened grapes, which are the fruit of autumn's harvest and a symbol of the ripeness and maturity of that season which precedes winter. In the allegory of the seasons, autumn is the time of maturity in human life, preceding death, Keats's season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. David depicts his son at the start of life reaching for the ripeness of maturity, a beautiful emblem expressing hope for his son's future development and maturation, an idea of capital importance for parents during this period, when, as mentioned earlier, infant and childhood mortality was so high. Thus, the statue could serve as a talisman and magically predict as well as protect the child's future life. David made the allegorical meaning explicit in the plaster version seen here. A snake is slithering up to Robert's left heel, a feature of the monument that frightened David's friend Béranger when he first saw it. David may have included the snake in his original idea because he often thought of the beginning and the end of life together. He wrote, "Death and childhood are so poetic, a cradle and a coffin, that is human biography." David suppressed this element of darkness associated with man's fall and mortality in the marble version. He may have made yet another drawing, however, associated with his son. Here we are looking at a beautiful drawing of a child's hand clasping onto the finger of an adult, a tender emblem of the strength and bond of the child and parent, captured through the holding of the hands. This may be yet another record of David's experience with his young son. He wrote in his notebook, "When I was in the street holding my little Robert by the hand, with my thoughts preoccupied by vague reveries concerning existence, his sweet voice brought me back to earth." In concluding, I'd like to note the way in which David unites the scientific materialism of the 18th century Enlightenment with an almost mystical faith in the efficacy and communicability of signs. This is also made manifest in his fidelity to the use of the human mind to ameliorate the human condition and his commitment to revolutionary ideals. When I first began working on David d'Angers, he was considered to be a stalwart representative of the traditions of neoclassical sculpture. It was Jacques Decazzo's seminal article on David's Romanticism, followed by his book on the subject, that put paid to the idea of David d'Angers as simply a neoclassical sculptor. What I've emphasized here today in stressing the almost mystical nature of David's attachment to a universal language of signs is the extent to which the artist's mind was instinct with Romanticism. As was mentioned earlier, he had a great admiration for the German Romantic thinkers, writers, and artists. In fact, there are aspects of his thought which often link him with figures such as Goethe and Novalis even more than his French counterparts. When I was a graduate student at Berkeley, Jacques Decazzo gave me a copy of the published notebooks of David d'Angers and informed me that I would make the acquaintance of a fascinating mind. What we have discussed here tonight and what is vividly displayed in this beautiful and important exhibition are the transactions of consciousness between the sculptor and the world. To paraphrase Ralph Waldo Emerson in another context, his thought is so passionate and alive that it adorns nature with a new thing. Happily, many of the new things done by this amazing artist are available to us in this wonderful exhibition. Thank you. And I think are there time for questions? No, okay. Should I tell them about the exhibition? Many of the works that I showed are available sometimes in smaller replica form in the exhibition, and many of the medallions, in fact, are actually down in the exhibition. So we'd be very happy if you would like to go down and look at the exhibition, and I'd be happy to answer questions down there, and I think Emerson is going with me. Thank you.